This video we're going to be looking at the endocrine system. The endocrine system, it's so important. We're going to be looking at glands and hormones. So when we looked at the nervous system, we mentioned that that was the primary internal communication system within the human body. The endocrine system is the other one. And it's so important. Hormones have been described as messengers of life. That's how crucial they are to our survival. So what is the endocrine system? Well, it has a bit of a meaty definition here, and it's important that you learn this. The endocrine system is a chemical communication system. It regulates the activity of cells and organs that carry out vital physiological processes throughout the body. And it does so by communicating through the bloodstream. It uses blood vessels to transport these hormones. And these hormones travel through the blood vessels, through our bloodstream, around the body to specific target cells that have a receptor for that hormone. And when the hormone interacts with its target cell, then it's going to produce a variety of different effects, which we'll discover soon. Most hormones affect cells in more than one organ. So, for example, the thyroid gland produces thyroxine, we'll learn about in a moment, which affects different cells throughout the body, which increases metabolic rate, and that affects growth. But thyroxine also affects cells in the heart to increase heart rate. So hormones typically affect cells in more than one organ. The endocrine system works alongside the nervous system, but it is much slower acting. It is about 2 to 3 seconds. So endocrine responses are about 2 to 3 seconds, but they last much longer because it takes time for then those hormones to disappear from the bloodstream. It means that it is slower but longer lasting. So while a nerve impulse is very, very quick but short-lived, an endocrine response is slower but longer lasting. When I say they work alongside, the endocrine system works alongside the nervous system. Think about, for example, in the fight or flight response. This involves both the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. And we'll be looking at the fight or flight response later on. We're going to be talking about a variety of different glands and hormones. So a gland is the organ that produces or synthesizes the hormones. And the hormones are the chemical substances that circulate via blood vessels to particular target organs that have a receptor for that hormone. So here is the network of glands across the body that secrete these chemical messengers called hormones. The key gland is the pituitary gland. This is known as our master gland. Dozens of hormones have been identified, and we are still discovering others. This table here is really important for you to know. While these glands haven't been listed specifically on the spec, you might be asked scenarios where it's clearly referencing one of these glands and one of these hormones. So important that you learn the glands, their associated hormones, and the effects that they have throughout the different areas of the body. All right, so let's start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland and is responsible for stimulating or controlling the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. And if we just move on to look at this next diagram here, you can kind of see how they're working in unison. So the hypothalamus releases many hormones, including one called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. It is fine for you to refer to as CRH for short. When the brain interprets some sort of stressor, like in the fight or flight response we'll learn about later, the hypothalamus produces CRH. CRH stimulates the pituitary gland, which then stimulates ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, then to produce adrenaline. And so the hypothalamus is responsible for stimulating and controlling the release of hormones like CRH from the pituitary gland. And that's why sometimes the hypothalamus is referred to as the control system, which regulates the endocrine system. Okay, so let's move on now to look at the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is our pituitary gland here, tiny little gland deep in the center of our brain. It's sometimes known as the master gland because the hormones that are released by the pituitary gland control and stimulate the release of hormones from all other glands in the endocrine system. You can see here that the pituitary gland is divided into two different sections: the anterior, the front of the pituitary gland, and the back or the rear of the pituitary gland, and each release different hormones. So if we just take a look here, the pituitary gland, as we can see, is that master gland because it's controlling the release of hormones from other glands throughout the body. A key hormone that's released from the anterior, the front of the pituitary gland, is growth hormone. Growth hormone stimulates growth and repair, unsurprisingly, in bones, in muscles, and in organs. And there's a lot of current research being carried out to identify the functions of growth hormone in adults. From the posterior, from the rear of the pituitary gland, one key hormone is oxytocin. This is sometimes referred to as the love or the cuddle hormone. This is responsible for contractions of the uterus during childbirth. It is responsible for the stimulation of breast milk when breastfeeding. And it's also involved in bonding, hence the name, the love hormone. Another key hormone that is released from the anterior lobe is the adrenocorticotropin hormone, or ACTH. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortical hormones, for example, cortisol, during the long-term stress response. So for an ongoing stressor. All right, now we move on to look at the pineal gland. The main hormone that is released from the pineal gland is melatonin. We're going to be learning a lot more about this when we look at biological rhythms. Melatonin is responsible for regulating our biological rhythms, including the sleep-wake cycle. The pineal gland responds in low light conditions, i.e. nighttime. And in low light conditions, the pineal gland releases melatonin, which stimulates sleep. During the day, melatonin is inhibited. The pineal gland recognizes that there is no light and therefore there is no melatonin, and then we don't sleep. And we're going to be looking at the effects of this for people who are jet lagged or work night shift, for example. All right, the next gland is the thyroid gland, located here in your neck. The thyroid gland produces thyroxine, which is responsible for basically regulating metabolism. The next gland we can see here just on top of our kidneys, here and here, is our adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is divided into two parts. We have the adrenal medulla, or medulla, or medulla, and we have the cortex. Each are responsible for releasing different hormones. So the medulla is responsible for producing adrenaline. This we know plays a key role in the fight or flight response. The adrenal cortex is responsible for releasing cortical hormones like cortisol. This is responsible for stimulating the release of glucose, which provides the body with energy, and is also for suppressing the immune system. we know that cortisol is also responsible for the long-term stress response. Hence why sometimes when you're stressed for a long period of time, like in exams, you might develop a cold, because that same hormone that's released for that long-term chronic stressor is also impacting there on your immune system. All right, now we move on to look at the gonads. We look at the male and female specific glands. So males and females, as you know, have different sex organs. So in females, we have the ovaries. These release estrogen. And that's important for the regulation of the female reproductive system. So in other words, the menstrual cycle. And pregnancy. In males, we have the testes. They release different androgens, i.e. male sex hormones, the main one being testosterone. Testosterone is responsible for the development of male sex characteristics. So during puberty, that is. And it also helps to develop and promote muscle growth. So male sex characteristics, things like facial hair, that kind of thing. All right, so they are the main glands and hormones throughout the body. It's important that you know what gland produces which hormones and what effect they have on the body. So let's have a look now at how the nervous system and the endocrine system work together in the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response being the physiological changes that occur in response to a stressor. Okay, so the key thing to note is that the endocrine system is not part of the nervous system, but the endocrine system and the nervous system often work in parallel one another. For example, here in a stressful event, when we encounter a stressor and the fight or flight response is activated. So when there is a threat detected, for example, a big scary tiger or a bear, the hypothalamus, remember this diagram from earlier, activates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. It is doing this through neural pathways, where we have action potentials and synaptic transmission. At the same time, the hypothalamus is also activating the sympathomedullary pathway, or SAM for short. This is our response to a short-term or an acute stressor. So if the situation requires a short-term stress response, then the sympathomedullary pathway is activated. This triggers the fight or flight response. There is a series of physiological changes which trigger this response. It leads to the stimulation of the adrenal glands. Here we've got the introduction of the endocrine system. When the adrenal glands are activated, they secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream, and this triggers a variety of different physiological responses. For example, heart rate increases, pupils dilate, respiration increases. These are some of the key effects of the fight or flight response. All in all, they create arousal, and this is necessary to prepare our body to fight or flight or confront our stressor. After the stressor has passed, then the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is going to return our body to resting state. So now we're going back into that rest or digest state. So heart rate's going to decrease, respiration will decrease, our pupils will constrict once again. So we can see here that In response to a stressor, the endocrine system is involved as well as our autonomic nervous system through the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. Now, who knew that we would evaluate the fight or flight response? Surely this is a biological response that is either true or it's not true. But there are a few key takeaways here. So we're going to be looking at how this response is adaptive, but actually maybe in today's modern era, it might not be so adaptive. We're going to be looking at individual differences in the fight or flight response, as well as gender bias that may be inherent. So, we know that the fight or flight response is vital for our survival as a species. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the fight or flight response, if our body didn't prepare us to confront stresses. And it is an incredibly useful survival mechanism for our ancestors when they were facing genuinely life-threatening situations, like that bear or like that tiger. The fight or flight response was crucial to preparing their body to respond to that. However, in the modern day, it's very, very rare that our body requires an intense biological response like the fight or flight response. Modern day stresses like work or a commute or congested living means that we may be repeatedly activating the fight or flight response. This can have really negative consequences on our health, and the increase in heart disease and obesity can be linked back to the increased stress on our bodies. If we are continually facing a lot of stress, if we are continually activating the sympathetic nervous system, then this is going to put increasing pressure on our cardiovascular system, which can lead to increased blood pressure, which can lead to damaged blood vessels, and which can lead to, ultimately, heart disease. There are also, perhaps, individual differences in the fight or flight response. We assume because it's biological that it's universal, but that may not be the case. There has been research looking at the stress response in infants during Ainsworth's strange situation, so measuring their autonomic nervous response by looking at the levels of cortisol and adrenaline in the blood. And they found that there was some sort of correlation there between the amount of stress hormones produced and the specific genes that the person had. And so there seems to be here some sort of link between genes and the level of activity in response to fight or flight. Further to this, there have been twin studies which show that there is some degree of heredity in stress response. For example, monozygotic twins have a much more similar response than dizygotic twins. So again, it suggests that there is some sort of genetic basis to the stress response which can account for these individual differences. So it means that perhaps the fight or flight response is not a universal response. Maybe there are individual differences that need to be considered. And this takes us to our final point, which is that there is maybe gender bias inherent in this response. Most early research into the fight or flight response was conducted on males, which means that there is some degree of androcentrism in this response, or in research into this response. You're going to learn more about gender bias and androcentrism next year. Why was early research conducted on males? Well, women are outliers. Women, unfortunately, have that pesky little issue of the menstrual cycle, which means that our levels of hormones throughout the month fluctuate. Ovulation affects these hormones, which means that we're quite difficult to study in that respect, and that's why most clinical drug trials also exclude female participants, because we are just too confounding. And so most early research on the fight or flight response was only including male subjects. And this has led to perhaps a beta bias, which is where researchers have assumed that females respond in the same way as males. They assume that what is true for males can then be applied to females, and that will respond in the same way. That was until Taylor argued that instead of a fight or flight response, women actually favour what is called a tend and befriend response. A tend and befriend response is when, rather than fighting or fleeing, women actually actively seek social support from one another. They tend to their children and they befriend others. Why might that be important for women? Why attend and befriend rather than a fight or flight response? Well, the fight or flight response may actually be counterintuitive for women. If we're running away, we might be putting ourselves, who are perhaps less physically able to flee from a stressor, and our offspring at risk of danger. And so for us, actually, there's sort of power in numbers. If we can actually be part of a group, then we are individually perhaps more safe. This tend to be friend response in females can be explained by that hormone oxytocin, that love hormone, which actually makes us more sociable and less anxious. And there are interesting sex differences here between men and women. So men who produce androgens, male sex hormones, means that the effects of oxytocin are actually reduced. They don't have the same sort of power of oxytocin as women do, because male sex hormones are reducing their effect. Female sex hormones, like estrogen on the other hand, increase the effects of oxytocin, which means that we are more likely to seek social support than men. And this just means that there are gender differences in the stress response. Again, it's not a universal response.